They refused to pay the Black Navy veteran for rebuilding the ship. Then no captain would sail it. The cardboard box in Elias Cole's arms rattled with every step he took across the dry dock's steel gangway, wrenches and calipers and a battered brass level sliding against one another with a sound like small bells. 41 years of tools, 41 years of trust, packed into a box that smelled like grease and salt air, carried out under a grey October sky while 3 naval officers stood at attention near the bow of the ship he had just spent 11 months rebuilding, arms crossed, faces unreadable, saying nothing. Nobody offered to help him carry it. Behind him, towering over the dry dock like a grey cathedral, sat the USS Harlan County, a guided missile destroyer that 8 months earlier had limped back from a Pacific deployment with her hull torn open below the waterline, her keel cracked, her superstructure scorched from an engine room fire that had nearly claimed her. The Navy had called her a loss. 2 shipyards had refused the contract outright, citing risk, cost, and timeline. The 3rd shipyard had taken the job only because Elias Cole agreed to lead the structural rebuild personally, at a rate far below what any comparable specialist would have charged, because he believed, the way he had believed most things in his 67 years, that doing the work right mattered more than being paid what he was worth. He was wrong about that this time. It would cost him almost everything. "Mr. Cole." The voice belonged to Roger Hastings, the shipyard's newly installed executive director, a trim man in his 50s with a blazer too crisp for a dry dock and a smile that never once reached his eyes. He stood at the top of the gangway with a clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. "Security will escort you to the gate. Your access badge has been deactivated." "I've got trials in 9 days," Elias said, setting the box down carefully so nothing inside would break. "The final structural inspection isn't filed yet. I need to walk the aft compartment one more time before—" "That won't be necessary." Hastings didn't look up from his clipboard. "We've reviewed your invoices and found significant discrepancies. Until this office completes an internal audit, your contract is suspended, effective immediately." "Discrepancies?" Elias repeated the word slowly, the way a man repeats something he wants to make sure he heard correctly. "I logged every hour, every weld, every material requisition, signed off by your own quality office, every single week for 11 months. You've had those records the entire time. Then the audit will confirm that, and you'll be paid in full, eventually." Hastings finally looked at him, and something in his expression made it clear that eventually meant never, or as close to never as bureaucracy could arrange. "In the meantime, I'd ask you not to make this difficult in front of our guests." Only then did Elias notice them. A small cluster of visitors near the bow, admirals' aides and shipyard board members in dark coats, here for a preview tour ahead of next week's press event announcing the Harlan County's historic return to service. Reporters, photographers, a rear admiral in dress blues, hands clasped behind his back, watching the exchange with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned long ago not to intervene in another command's business, even when something about it clearly troubled him. Elias understood in that instant, precisely what was happening. This wasn't an audit, this was a stage, and Roger Hastings needed a villain removed from it before the curtain went up. Needed a story where the credit for an impossible rebuild belonged to the shipyard, not to a black independent contractor whose name would otherwise have to appear on every press release. Every certification, every plaque, bolted to a bulkhead that would outlive them both. He looked at the 3 officers standing near midships. He recognized one of them, Commander Alvarez, whom he had walked through the aft engine room 3 weeks earlier, explaining weld sequences with the kind of pride a man allows himself only rarely. Alvarez had shaken his hand that day and said, "This is the finest structural repair I've seen in 20 years of service, Mr. Cole." Now the commander stood with his jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past Elias's shoulder, saying nothing, because saying something would have meant contradicting a superior in front of an admiral. And men learn early in the Navy which battles are worth their careers. $214,000, Elias said quietly, not to Hastings, but to the space around him, to anyone within earshot who might remember it later. That's what this shipyard owes me, not counting the materials I fronted out of my own pocket in March when your supplier missed a delivery and the whole project would have stalled a month waiting on paperwork. I want that on the record. Noted, Hastings said, already turning away. Security. Two men in yard uniforms approached, not roughly, but with the practiced discomfort of people asked to do something they privately found distasteful. One of them, a young man named Marcus Deal, who had worked under Elias for the better part of the rebuild, wouldn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole," Deal murmured as he reached for the box. "I really am." "You don't have to carry it," Elias said. "I've carried heavier." He picked the box back up himself and walked the length of the pier alone, past the officers who wouldn't look at him, past the reporters who hadn't yet realized there was a story unfolding 6 feet from their cameras, past the ship itself, the great grey hull he had rebuilt plate by plate, weld by weld, through a summer so hot the steel blistered bare skin, and a winter so cold his hands cracked and bled inside his gloves. He didn't look back at her. He had learned a long time ago that looking back at things you loved and couldn't keep only made the walking harder. But 8 months earlier, when he first stood beneath that same shattered hull, none of this seemed possible. Not the rebuild, not the friendship he'd find with half the yard crew, and certainly not the day they would walk him out of it in front of an admiral like a man caught stealing. Elias Cole had been born in 1958 in a shotgun house 3 streets back from the Norfolk waterfront, close enough that as a boy he could hear the horns of departing ships through his bedroom window, and imagine, long before he understood what any of it meant, that steel hulls carried something like promises inside them. His father worked the docks unloading freight for wages that never quite covered the month. His mother took in laundry from officers' wives who never learned her first name. Elias was the third of 5 children, and by the time he was 12, he understood without ever being told directly that some doors in the world opened easily for some people and had to be forced open, slowly, painfully for others. He enlisted in the Navy at 18, not out of some romantic notion of service, but because it was, in 1976, one of the only paths available to a young black man from his neighborhood that didn't lead directly back into the same cycle of scraping wages his father had lived his whole life. He trained as a hull technician, learned to weld in compartments so tight a grown man could barely turn around, learned the discipline of checking a weld 3 times before certifying it once, because a bad weld below the waterline wasn't an inconvenience. It was 180 sailors trusting their lives to a seam of metal they would never see. He served 12 years, 2 deployments, and 1 incident he rarely spoke about even decades later. A fire aboard the USS Conway in 1984 that started in an improperly inspected engine compartment and killed 3 sailors before it was brought under control. Elias had been 26 years old, off duty, asleep 2 decks up, and had spent the rest of that night pulling men through smoke he still sometimes tasted in his dreams 40 years afterward. The investigation that followed found the fire had started at a weld joint that had been certified by an inspector under pressure to meet a deployment deadline, signed off without a proper secondary check, because a commanding officer wanted the ship underway, on schedule. Elias never forgot that. It became, in a way, neither his family nor his colleagues ever fully understood until much later, the entire architecture of who he became. He left the Navy at 30 with an honorable discharge, a chief petty officer's rating, and an unshakable belief that no ship should ever leave port because someone was in a hurry. He spent the next 37 years building a reputation, 1 shipyard at a time, as a structural hull specialist, first as an employee, then, Once he understood how often companies undervalued the men who did the most dangerous work. As an independent contractor, he earned certifications that took most engineers a decade to accumulate. He became one of a small handful of inspectors nationwide licensed at Level 3 for underwater hull welding on Legacy Spruance and Arleigh Burke-class hull configurations, a designation so specialized that when older ships needed emergency structural work, shipyards across 3 states would call his cell phone directly rather than wait for a staff engineer to become available. He married young, lost his wife to cancer 11 years into the marriage, raised his son largely alone while working 60-hour weeks in shipyards up and down the eastern seaboard. He never remarried. He put his son through college on a welder's wages and a fierce, quiet discipline about money that meant he drove the same truck for 19 years and lived in the same modest house he'd bought in 1991, even after his day rate climbed high enough that he could have afforded something considerably grander. His son, David, was 36 now, a hospital administrator in Richmond who called every Sunday evening without fail, and who had, over the years, developed a habit of quietly reviewing his father's contracts whenever Elias let him, worried in the particular way adult children worry about parents who have spent a lifetime absorbing unfairness without complaint. "You let people take advantage of you, Dad," David told him once years earlier after discovering a shipyard in Baltimore had shorted Elias nearly $30,000 on a contract he'd simply written off rather than fight. "You do the hardest work in the building and let them decide what it's worth." "I decide what it's worth," Elias had answered. "Not unkindly. I just don't always decide it's worth the fight it'd take to collect it. There's a difference, son, even if it doesn't always look like one from the outside." It was a philosophy that had served him mostly across 4 decades, a careful calculation of which battles were worth the toll they'd take, which slights could be absorbed and which could not, forged in a childhood where his father had taught him, without ever quite saying it directly, that a black man who fought every unfairness he encountered would spend his entire life fighting and none of it building. Elias had chosen instead to build, quietly, meticulously, one certified weld at a time, letting the work itself stand as an argument no one could easily dismiss. What he hadn't yet learned in October of that year, standing on the pier with a box of tools in his arms, was that some men were never going to be persuaded by the work alone, that for Roger Hastings, the quality of Elias's welds was never actually the question. The question, unspoken but governing every decision Hastings made that year, was simpler and older than any shipyard contract. Whether a man who looked like Elias Cole was entitled to be paid what a white specialist of equal skill would have been paid without a second thought, and whether anyone would notice or care if he wasn't. By the time the Harlan County came into dry dock, broken and half abandoned by 2 shipyards that didn't believe she could be saved, Elias Cole was 67 years old, widely regarded within a narrow, specialized circle as one of the finest structural repair engineers on the East Coast, and almost entirely unknown to anyone outside that circle, least of all to Roger Hastings, who had been installed as the shipyard's executive director 8 months into the rebuild after the previous director retired, and who arrived with opinions about cost control that had very little patience for an independent black contractor, billing what Hastings privately considered an outrageous day rate for what he assumed, without ever once walking the compartments himself, was simple manual labor. The friction began small, the way most injustices do, not with a single dramatic confrontation, but with 1,000 tiny erosions that, taken individually, could each be explained away as oversight, miscommunication, budget tightening, Elias had seen the pattern before, more times than he cared to count, across 4 decades, in an industry that had never fully made peace with men like him, rising to positions where white executives were required to write him checks larger than their own quarterly bonuses. His invoices, which had been processed within 10 business days under the previous director, began taking 6, then 8, then 11 weeks. When he asked about it, the shipyard's accounting office cited additional documentation review, though no additional documentation was ever actually requested. Meanwhile, the 2 subcontracted engineering firms working alongside him, both owned by white men Hastings had personally recruited from a previous posting, were paid on the standard 10-day cycle without incident. In April, during a Navy liaison visit, Commander Alvarez had specifically praised Elias's weld sequencing in the aft engine compartment, calling it, in front of the full shipyard leadership team, textbook, frankly better than textbook. Hastings, standing beside him, had smiled and said, "Our engineering team has done remarkable work," gesturing vaguely at the compartment without once mentioning Elias's name, though Elias stood not 10 feet away in full view of everyone present. In June, a young structural engineer named Peter Voss, freshly hired from a firm Hastings had previously worked for, was assigned to shadow Elias's repair methodology, ostensibly for training purposes. Elias, who took genuine pride in mentoring younger tradespeople and had spent years quietly teaching apprentices skills that university engineering programs rarely covered, welcomed him without suspicion. 3 weeks later, a shipyard newsletter profiled Voss as leading the innovative repair approach on the Harlan County's hull, with photographs taken in a compartment Elias had personally welded, credit for a technique Elias had developed over decades, reduced to a single sentence. With support from senior contracted staff. Elias said nothing publicly. He had learned across a lifetime of swallowing exactly this kind of quiet theft that fighting every small erasure cost more energy than the rebuild itself demanded. And the rebuild demanded everything he had. He kept his own meticulous records instead. Logs, dated photographs of every weld before and after inspection, signed materials requisitions, time-stamped video walkthroughs he recorded on his phone each Friday evening, documenting the week's progress. A habit he'd maintained since his earliest years as an independent contractor, born from decades of watching men who looked like him get quietly written out of credit they had earned. It was a habit that would matter more than he could have imagined, in ways he did not yet understand. By August, with trials looming and the rebuild nearly 2 months ahead of even the most optimistic original schedule, a fact that saved the Navy an estimated $4 million in extended dry dock fees, Hastings began a different kind of pressure. He requested, informally at first and then in writing, that Elias complete the final structural certification on an accelerated basis, signing off on the aft keel repair and the underwater hull plating before Elias's standard secondary inspection protocol was complete. Elias refused. There was a budget review meeting in late August that Elias was asked to attend, ostensibly to answer technical questions about the remaining timeline, though it became clear within minutes that its real purpose was something else entirely. Hastings had assembled the shipyard's finance team, 2 board members visiting from the corporate office, and Peter Voss, and had opened the meeting by presenting a slide comparing contractor day rates across the project. Elias's rate highlighted in red at the top of the chart, positioned to appear without any accompanying context about scope, certification level, or the specialized nature of below-waterline structural work, as an outlier draining the budget. "I want to be transparent about where our costs are concentrated," Hastings told the room, not once looking at Elias, who sat at the far end of the table in his work coveralls, having come straight from the aft compartment. "You're welcome to be transparent," Elias said, when the silence stretched long enough to make clear no one else intended to speak. I'd ask that the transparency include the fact that I'm the only Level 3 certified inspector on this contract, that I've personally absorbed over $60,000 in material costs when your supplier missed deliveries twice this year, and that the two firms above me on your org chart bill nearly the same hourly rate for work requiring a fraction of the certification I carry. If we're being transparent, let's be all the way transparent. One of the visiting board members, a woman named Carol Ibsen, glanced at the chart again, then at Hastings, with an expression Elias recognized instantly. Not quite disbelief, but the particular discomfort of someone realizing a story had been framed for her benefit and wondering, for the first time, why. Hastings moved the meeting along quickly after that, but the chart did not appear again in any subsequent presentation, and Elias understood, watching him do it, that he had made an enemy that day rather than a correction. 2 weeks later, a smaller incident occurred that Elias mentioned to almost no one. You know how it is with some of these older guys who came up in the trades. They think because they've got a certification, the rules don't apply to them the way they apply to everybody else. Elias stood in the hallway a moment longer than he needed to, said nothing, filed the requisition, and walked back out to the ship, where the work, at least, never lied to him about what it thought of who he was. The secondary check isn't a formality, he told Hastings in a meeting in early September, the only time the two men had ever spoken directly for longer than a few clipped sentences. It's the whole point. I don't sign a certification until I've personally verified every weld twice, independently on different days, in different light. That's not bureaucracy. That's the difference between a ship that comes home and one that doesn't. We have a commissioning date, Mr. Cole. The Admiral's office has already scheduled the press event. I need this expedited. Then you'll need to move the press event, Elias said. I served on a ship where somebody signed off early because a deadline mattered more than a proper check. 3 men died in that engine room. I'm 67 years old, Mr. Hastings. I've buried enough good men to know exactly what a rushed signature costs, and I promise you, it costs a great deal more than a delayed press release. Hastings hadn't argued further that day. He had simply nodded, made a note on his clipboard, and thanked Elias for his time in a tone so carefully neutral that Elias should have recognized it, in hindsight, as the sound of a decision already being made about him. Not about the ship, but about him personally, about how inconvenient it would be to keep paying a man who couldn't be pressured, who kept his own records, who had the audacity to hold a line the shipyard's own executive director wanted erased. There was one more incident in early October, 4 days before the removal, that Elias would later describe to investigators as the moment he understood the situation had moved beyond ordinary budget friction into something more deliberate. A junior Navy contracting officer, new to the base and unfamiliar with the rebuild's history, had stopped by the aft compartment to observe the final structural walkthrough, and upon meeting Elias in his coveralls, hard hat and tool belt, had asked, not unkindly but with an assumption so automatic it barely registered as an insult to the man making it, whether he could get someone to fetch the lead engineer for a few questions. "You're looking at him," Elias said, extending a gloved hand. The officer's discomfort was immediate and visible, the particular scramble of a person realizing in real time exactly what assumption they'd just made and precisely how it had been received. He apologized. Elias accepted the apology with the same equanimity he brought to most things, and the walkthrough continued without further incident. But Elias mentioned it briefly to Commander Alvarez afterward, not as a complaint, but as an observation. "Happens more than people realize," Elias said. 41 years in this trade, and I still get asked to fetch the engineer more often than I get treated as one, especially by folks who haven't worked with me before. Doesn't bother me the way it used to. Just tells me something true about how the world still sees the man doing the work versus the man signing off on it. Alvarez had no good answer for that, and didn't pretend to. It was a small moment, one of hundreds Elias had absorbed across a long career, notable only in hindsight for how closely it foreshadowed what Hastings would do 4 days later, not out of confusion this time, but out of calculation, betting that the same assumption the young officer had made instinctively could be made to work in his favor if he simply removed the inconvenient evidence of who had actually done the work, before anyone important enough to matter arrived to see it for themselves. 4 days later, 9 days before scheduled sea trials, with the aft hull complete and every weld Elias had ever laid down on that ship sound and true and thoroughly inspected exactly the way he'd promised it would be, Roger Hastings stood at the top of a gangway with a clipboard pressed to his chest and told Elias Cole his contract was suspended, his badge deactivated, his final invoice under indefinite review, and had him escorted off the property in full view of a rear admiral, 3 commanding officers, and a cluster of reporters who had come to photograph a triumph, and instead, without quite realizing it yet, had just witnessed the opening act of something considerably larger. Elias walked to the gate, box of tools rattling with every step, and did not look back at the ship. But that night, alone in the small house he had lived in for 34 years, he opened his laptop, pulled up 11 months of dated video logs, signed requisition forms and certified inspection records, and began, methodically, the way he approached everything, to write down exactly what had happened and exactly what he intended to do about it. He did not yet know that within 9 days, the United States Navy would discover something Roger Hastings had never bothered to understand, that Elias Cole was not simply the man who had rebuilt the Harlan County's hull. He was, at that moment, the only Level 3 certified underwater weld inspector in the region, qualified to sign off on that specific legacy hull configuration, and without his signature on the final structural certification, no commanding officer in the United States Navy would ever be permitted, under federal maritime safety regulation, to take that ship to sea. Part 2. The trouble surfaced 4 days before sea trials, during a routine pre-departure documentation review conducted by Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitfield, the shipyard's liaison safety officer, a meticulous woman who had built her entire career on the unglamorous, essential work of making sure paperwork matched reality before anyone risked 180 lives on the accuracy of that match. She found the gap on a Tuesday afternoon, buried in a stack of nearly 400 pages of structural certification documents. The final underwater hull weld inspection for the aft keel repair, arguably the single most critical structural element of the entire rebuild, was missing its Level 3 sign-off. Every other certification in the package bore Elias Cole's signature and license number. This one, dated the week of his removal, did not. She brought it to Hastings first, assuming reasonably an administrative oversight. "It's being handled," Hastings told her, waving a hand. "Voss will complete the sign-off by Thursday." "Voss isn't Level 3 certified for this hull class," Whitfield said. "I checked. He's Level 2. He can inspect, but he cannot legally certify below waterline structural welds on a legacy Spruance derivative hull configuration. That requires Level 3. Then find another Level 3 inspector." Whitfield made 11 phone calls over the following 2 days. There were, in the entire region, 4 engineers currently holding active Level 3 underwater weld certification for that specific legacy hull class. 2 had retired the previous year. 1 was recovering from surgery and not cleared for field inspection duty. The 4th was Elias Cole, whose contract had been suspended, whose badge had been deactivated, and who, when Whitfield finally reached him by phone on Wednesday evening, listened to her request with a long, careful silence before responding. "I'd be glad to complete the certification, Commander," he said. "Same rate as my contract specified, full payment of all outstanding invoices." in writing before I set foot back on that ship, and I'll need my standard 48 hours for a proper secondary inspection. I don't rush a below-waterline sign-off for anybody, including you. Mr. Cole, we have sea trials scheduled for Monday. Then somebody should have thought about that before they walked me off the property 9 days ago, owing me $214,000, Elias said, his voice even, without malice, simply stating a fact the way he had spent his entire career, stating facts about steel and stress tolerances and the honest limits of what could and could not be safely certified. I'm not interested in punishing anybody, Commander. I'm interested in doing this job the way it's supposed to be done. The same as I've always been, but I won't be pressured twice by the same shipyard in the same month. Before relaying the conversation upward, Whitfield spent that Wednesday night doing something Roger Hastings had apparently never bothered to do in 8 months of overseeing the project. She read the full certification file cover to cover, not merely checking for the presence of signatures, but actually reviewing what those signatures represented. She found 11 months of dated inspection logs, cross-referenced against material requisitions and independent quality control photographs, each entry meticulous to a degree she rarely encountered, even among engineers with considerably more institutional backing than an independent contractor typically carried. She found, buried in an appendix, Elias's own account of the 1984 Conway fire, submitted as part of his original safety methodology statement at the start of the contract. A document she later admitted she wished she had read 8 months earlier, because it would have told her everything she needed to understand about why this particular 67-year-old man was not going to be rushed into a signature under any circumstances, career-ending threats included. I don't think you understand what you're dealing with, she told Hastings directly in a follow-up conversation the next morning after her 9-hour review. This isn't a contractor being difficult over money. This is the most thoroughly documented structural certification file I have ever personally reviewed in 11 years of naval safety oversight, attached to a man who watched 3 sailors die because someone rushed exactly this kind of sign-off 40 years ago. You didn't just remove an inconvenient contractor, Mr. Hastings. You removed the only person on this entire project who was never, under any circumstances, going to let you cut this corner. I need you to understand how that's going to look to anyone who reviews this file after today. Hastings did not have a ready answer. Whitfield relayed the conversation to the Rear Admiral's office the following morning, and within hours, what had been a quiet documentation gap became, very suddenly, a matter of significant institutional concern. A Rear Admiral does not appreciate discovering, 4 days before a scheduled sea trial with press in attendance, that the ship he is preparing to certify combat-ready cannot legally be certified at all, not because of any deficiency in the work itself, but because the shipyard's executive director had removed, apparently for reasons entirely unrelated to performance, the only qualified engineer capable of signing the paperwork. The Admiral's office requested an emergency meeting. Roger Hastings arrived expecting to explain a scheduling inconvenience. He left 4 hours later, having explained considerably more than he intended, because Lieutenant Commander Whitfield, thorough by nature and now genuinely alarmed by what she was uncovering, had pulled the shipyard's full financial and contracting records for the previous 18 months while preparing her report. What she found went well beyond one delayed invoice. Roger Hastings had, since taking over as executive director, systematically delayed or reduced payment to no fewer than 6 minority-owned contracting firms and independent specialists across 3 separate Navy repair contracts, while processing payments to white-owned subcontracting firms, several with prior personal or professional ties to Hastings himself, on standard or even expedited schedules. In two instances, funds allocated for contractor payment had instead been redirected toward a discretionary shipyard improvement account that Hastings personally controlled, with reporting language vague enough to obscure the redirection from a casual audit, though not, as it turned out, from a determined one. Elias Cole's suspended contract wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment. It was the visible edge of a pattern Hastings had been running quietly for the better part of a year, betting, as men in his position so often do, that the people he shortchanged would either lack the standing to fight back or lack the appetite for a battle that history had taught them they were unlikely to win. He had badly misjudged Elias Cole. Among the 6 affected firms Whitfield's audit surfaced was a small electrical subcontracting company owned by a Filipino-American engineer named Rosa Bautista, who had been quietly absorbing 4 months of delayed payments on a separate destroyer contract. Convinced, as she later told investigators, that raising the issue too forcefully would simply see her firm quietly excluded from future Navy work altogether. A fear common enough among minority-owned contracting firms that it rarely needed to be spoken aloud to function as an effective deterrent. There was also a young black structural welder, barely 5 years into his own independent certification, who had taken on a smaller repair contract under Hastings's tenure and, discouraged after 2 months of unanswered invoices, had simply stopped bidding on Navy contracts altogether, assuming the entire system worked this way and would continue to, regardless of what he did about it. It was this detail, more than any single dollar figure in the audit, that stayed with Lieutenant Commander Whitfield longest as she compiled her final report. "The damage isn't only financial," she wrote, in a section of the report rarely included in standard contracting reviews. "It is the quiet, cumulative effect of talented people deciding the system isn't built for them to succeed in, and removing themselves from it rather than continuing to fight for what they're owed." Mr. Cole's case is notable specifically because he refused to do that. Most people reasonably do not. The sea trials were postponed 9 days. It was, for Roger Hastings, an unmitigated professional catastrophe. The commissioning press event cancelled, the Admiral's office privately furious. A federal contracting review opened within 72 hours of Whitfield's report, reaching the Naval Sea Systems Command Inspector General's office. But for Elias, those 9 days unfolded with a kind of vindication he had neither expected nor, if he was honest with himself, particularly wanted. He had spent 41 years being quietly right about things nobody wanted to hear, and there was very little satisfaction, he discovered, in finally being loudly, publicly, undeniably right about the worst of it. He returned to the shipyard on a grey Thursday morning, badge reactivated, back pay wired to his account in full the previous afternoon, along with a formal written apology from the shipyard's board that Elias read once, folded carefully, and placed in a drawer without comment. He walked the gangway alone, the same gangway he had been walked down 9 days earlier, carrying not a box this time, but a single tablet loaded with 11 months of dated inspection records, and began his 48-hour secondary check exactly as he had told Commander Whitfield he would. Methodical, unhurried, uninterested in anyone's deadline but his own professional conscience. Commander Alvarez met him in the aft engine compartment on the second day, standing quietly near the hatch for a long moment before speaking. "I should have said something that day on the pier," Alvarez said. "I've thought about it every day since. I'm sorry, it wasn't right, and I knew it wasn't right while it was happening." Elias didn't look up from the weld seam he was inspecting. "You had an admiral standing next to you and a career riding on not making a scene," he said. "I understand exactly how that math works, Commander. I've been on the wrong side of it my whole life. What matters is what happens next, not what didn't happen 9 days ago. What does happen next?" Elias straightened finally and looked at him. "The ship gets certified because the ship earned it. That's what happens next. The rest of it, Hastings, the contract review, whatever the Navy decides to do about a director who's apparently been shortchanging contractors for a year, that's not my fight to finish. I fixed a hull. That's my job. I did it. He completed the certification on schedule exactly 48 hours after beginning and signed the underwater hull weld inspection for the USS Harlan County with the same careful, unhurried signature he had used on every certification of his career, a signature that, once affixed, meant 180 sailors could trust the steel beneath their feet without ever knowing his name, which was, in the end, precisely how Elias Cole had always understood the purpose of the work. Roger Hastings did not go quietly. In the days following the emergency meeting with the Admiral's office, he attempted twice to reach Elias directly, first through a text message that read only, "We should talk before this goes further. This doesn't have to be complicated," and later through a call Elias let go to voicemail. The message Hastings left was longer, more careful, the tone of a man recalculating in real time. "Elias, it's Roger. Listen, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the invoice review, and I'd like the chance to sort this out privately, professionally, before it becomes something bigger than it needs to be. I don't think either of us benefits from this turning into a whole federal matter. Call me back." Elias did not call him back. He forwarded the voicemail, unedited, to Lieutenant Commander Whitfield's investigative file, along with a brief note. "For the record, I don't negotiate certifications, and I don't negotiate what I'm owed after the fact. Both should have been settled the first time, without pressure either direction." It was, in the end, one more piece of a documentary record Elias had been building, deliberately or not, for the better part of his career. The habit of a man who had learned early that verbal promises evaporated the moment they became inconvenient, and that only what existed in writing, time-stamped and signed, ever actually held. The Inspector General's office interviewed Hastings formally on 3 separate occasions over the following month. According to the eventual public summary of the investigation, Hastings initially maintained that all payment delays were the result of standard administrative review. But the pattern uncovered in the shipyard's financial records, 6 affected contractors, all minority-owned, against a backdrop of on-time or expedited payments to firms with personal ties to Hastings himself, made that explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. By the 3rd interview, according to the summary, Hastings had retained outside counsel and declined to answer further questions without legal representation present, a decision that, while entirely within his rights, did little to slow the momentum of a review that had, by then, developed a life of its own within the Naval Sea Systems Command's Contracting Oversight Division. The Federal Contracting Review concluded 6 weeks later. Roger Hastings was terminated from the shipyard immediately, and the Naval Sea Systems Command Inspector General's office referred the matter for further review regarding potential violations of federal contracting and equal opportunity law, given the clear pattern of disparate payment practices affecting minority-owned contractors under his tenure. The shipyard's board issued a public statement acknowledging serious failures in contract administration and professional conduct, and announced a full independent audit of every contract processed during Hastings' tenure, along with restitution proceedings for every affected contractor identified in the review. 5 additional firms, beyond Elias's own case, several of whom had quietly absorbed losses for months, assuming, as Elias himself nearly had, that fighting simply wasn't worth what it would cost them. Elias didn't attend any of the disciplinary hearings. He wasn't summoned as anything more than a witness, and even then he answered the investigators' questions in the same measured, factual tone he brought to every weld inspection of his career. No outrage, no theatrics, simply the truth, laid out with dates and signatures and time-stamped video, because that, he had long ago decided, was the only kind of justice that ever actually held up over time. David, Flew down from Richmond the weekend the settlement was finalized, sitting across from his father at the same kitchen table where Elias had once explained why some fights weren't worth the cost of winning them. "You were wrong, you know," David said, sliding a printed copy of the shipyard's public apology across the table. "Or, not wrong exactly, but this time it was worth it. This time the Navy needed my signature to sail a ship," Elias said. "That's not the same as being heard. That's being necessary. There's a difference, and I don't want you thinking the world suddenly started listening to men like me because of a piece of paperwork it couldn't get around." "Maybe not," David said. "But Rosa Bautista got paid. That kid who quit bidding on contracts. The one Whitfield mentioned in her report." I looked him up. "He submitted a bid last month for the first time in 2 years. That happened because you didn't let it go, Dad. Not because a signature was required, because you kept records for 11 months like you always do, and this time somebody with enough power was finally forced to look at them." Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out the kitchen window toward the truck he'd driven for 19 years. Thought about his father unloading freight on the Norfolk docks for wages that never covered the month. Thought about 3 sailors he still, 40 years later, sometimes heard in his sleep. "I didn't do it for anybody else," he said finally. "I want to be honest with you about that. I did it because I wasn't going to let a man like Hastings decide what my work was worth when I know exactly what it's worth. If it helped somebody else along the way, I'm glad of it. But I didn't set out to be anybody's example." "I know," David said. "That's usually how it works out best, though. The people who never meant to be an example are the only ones anybody actually believes." The commissioning ceremony for the USS Harlan County finally took place 7 weeks later, on a clear, cold morning in early December. The same dry dock, crowded now with sailors in dress whites. A Navy band, families gathered along the pier, and considerably more press than the original event would have drawn, given that word of what had happened to the ship's structural engineer had by then travelled well beyond the shipyard's gates. The Rear Admiral, in his remarks, departed from his prepared statement to acknowledge, "By name, the man responsible for the vessel's rebuilt hull, a departure Elias hadn't requested and would have quietly declined if asked in advance. There is a tradition in this Navy," the Admiral said, "of honouring the men and women whose work we depend on but rarely see, the ones below decks, below the waterline, whose names never appear on a hull, but whose judgment every sailor aboard is trusting with their life every single day at sea. Mr. Elias Cole is one of those men. He served this Navy in uniform for 12 years, and he has served it in steel for 41 more, 8 months ago. 8. This shipyard nearly lost his expertise through a failure that had nothing to do with the quality of his work and everything to do with a failure of respect. I want it said plainly, in front of this crew and their families, that failure has been corrected, and it should never have happened in the first place." Elias stood near the back of the assembled crowd in a suit he'd bought for the occasion, uncomfortable with the attention but too dignified to visibly show it. The families around him wore their own kind of pride openly, mothers dabbing at eyes, children in small dress uniforms pointing up at the towering grey hull, the ship's sponsor breaking the traditional bottle across the bow to a roar of applause that rolled across the water and back. Elias applauded too, quietly, standing a little apart from the crowd, the way he had stood apart from most crowds his entire working life, more comfortable below decks than in front of one. A young sailor, no older than 19, approached him hesitantly near the end of the ceremony, having overheard someone in the crowd point Elias out. "Sir," the sailor said, "are you the one who fixed the hull? My chief said you're the reason we're not still sitting in dry dock." "I had some help," Elias said. "A lot of good people worked on this ship." "My mom used to work at a shipyard in Newport News," the sailor said. "Structural, like you. She always said nobody remembers the welders' names. said the whole Navy runs on people nobody remembers. Elias considered that for a moment, looking past the young sailor toward the hull rising grey and solid against the winter sky. "Your mom's right, mostly," he said, "but the ship remembers, even if the paperwork doesn't always say so plainly. Every seam holds because somebody made sure it would. That's worth something, whether or not anybody puts your name on a plaque for it." The sailor nodded slowly, the way young people do when they've been handed something true that will take years to fully understand, and thanked him before returning to his formation. When Commander Alvarez found him afterward and asked if he'd come aboard for the ceremonial first watch, Elias hesitated only a moment before accepting. He walked the aft engine compartment one final time that afternoon, alone, running a hand along a weld seam he had laid down himself 8 months earlier during a heat wave so brutal the steel had blistered his palms even through his gloves. He thought, as he often did in quiet moments like this one, about the 3 sailors who had died aboard the Conway in 1984 because someone had rushed a signature to meet a deadline that mattered less, in the end, than 3 men's lives. He thought about how close this ship had come to leaving port without his name on her certification. Not because his work was ever in question, but because a man in a blazer had decided, based on nothing but his own quiet prejudice, that Elias Cole's labor was worth less than his integrity demanded to be paid for. He didn't sue the shipyard beyond the restitution already secured. He didn't give the interviews several outlets requested. Beyond a single brief statement he provided in writing, "I did the work I was trained to do, the way I was trained to do it. I'm grateful the Navy took the paperwork as seriously as I did." He used a portion of his settlement, quietly, without announcement, to establish a scholarship fund at the same vocational school in Norfolk where he had first learned to weld at 19 years old, reserved specifically for young people from neighborhoods like the one he'd grown up in. Students who had the hands and the discipline for structural trade work, but not always the doors held open to reach it. Marcus Deal, the young shipyard worker who had apologized while carrying his box that October morning, became one of the program's first informal mentees, spending Saturday mornings in Elias's garage learning weld techniques, passed down through 41 years of a career that had nearly been erased by a single vindictive signature on a clipboard. By the following spring, the scholarship fund had grown beyond what Elias had originally intended after 2 shipyard trade associations and a regional Navy veterans organization asked to contribute, drawn in by a story that had, by then, quietly circulated through enough professional networks that Elias occasionally found himself recognized by strangers at supplier counters and welding supply shops. Something that still visibly unsettled him each time it happened. He used none of the additional funds for himself. He hired a part-time coordinator, a retired shipyard safety officer named Denise Okafor, to manage the program's growing administrative needs, and personally interviewed every one of the first cohort of 12 students, most of them from neighborhoods not unlike the one he'd grown up in, 3 streets back from the Norfolk waterfront. "I'm not running a charity," he told the first group of students, gathered in a borrowed classroom on a Saturday morning in March, in the same measured voice he'd once used to explain weld sequencing to a rear admiral's aide. "I'm running a pipeline. There's a difference. Charity makes people feel good about themselves for a day. A pipeline gets you a certification, a trade, and a paycheck nobody can quietly shortchange without consequences, because you'll know exactly what you're owed and exactly how to prove it. That's what I'm offering you. The rest is up to how hard you're willing to work." Rosa Bautista, whose electrical firm had also been shortchanged under Hastings' tenure, reached out to Elias not long after the settlement was finalized, and the two eventually established an informal referral relationship between their firms, each recommending the other to Navy project managers who valued precisely the kind of meticulous, well-documented work both of them had spent careers refining. often as the only viable defense available to contractors whose competence was too easily second-guessed by people who had never once walked the compartments they were paid to oversee. Some stories don't end with the world applauding loudly. They end with a ship that sails safely, a young apprentice learning an old trade, and a man who never asked for recognition finally receiving, at 67, exactly what had always been owed to him. Not applause, but respect, paid in full. At last, if this story moved you, share it. Men like Elias Cole rarely make headlines, but every ship that comes home safely carries their fingerprints in steel no one ever sees.